So here we go. All right. Good morning, everyone. Whoops. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, the last day of September. I think so. There's no September 31st now, is there? Who knows? We're living in a crazy world. I mean, there could be a September 31st at this point, and that wouldn't surprise me, but I don't think there is. So who's here? So Kevin's here. Good morning, Kevin. Shania's here. Good morning to you. And Mike's online this morning. Good morning, Mike. Ayushi's here. Good morning, Ayushi. And Ananda's here. Good morning to you. And Hidil's here. Good morning, Hidil. Okay, so what we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit more about our good friend Mussolini. We'll talk a little bit more about our friend Donald Trump. Sorry, he's just too newsworthy is the problem. And then we will read an article about Trump and fascism, and we'll start to take some steps toward writing our paper, which I assigned you yesterday, and that I will talk about a little bit more today. So we'll do those few things, okay? Before I go on, did anyone see any of the presidential debate last night between Trump and Joe Biden? Yeah, what happened? I didn't see it.
It was silly.
It was silly? Why was it silly?
Because he didn't let him speak. Trump just kept talking over him. And they were arguing like kids.
Yeah. Gross?
Gross.
Gross. Yeah. Anyone else see it? Didn't see it? Didn't see it? No? I think Amanda, I think your impression of it is most people's impression at this point, that it was a sad display for democracy, as these two leaders were, couldn't engage in debate, right? And so, if I may, I'm going to connect this to critical thinking, right? What those two guys should have been doing is debating each other's argument, right? Somebody should have put forth I think that we should expand healthcare in the U.S. because of this, this, and this, and then the other candidate will say, well, no, I don't agree with you because if you do this, then that won't work, and then they can actually debate their arguments. But that's not really what we saw, is it? No, we saw people fighting on camera, which is not that encouraging, right? No. Does democracy have a future, people? Are we going to see the end of democracy here? No? Sometimes I worry. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. We'll talk about Trump a little bit later on, so we don't have to talk about him now. We were talking about three versions of democracy, of modernity, or political modernity, as I was calling it. We talked about democracy. We know what it is. We talked about communism a little bit, and we'll come back to communism a little bit later when we talk about Russia. But now we're all about fascism. I can't help but look at you now when I say it, because you smile every time, which again is worrying. But so we said that fascists were way out on the right wing here, or the right side of the political spectrum. And so we said sometimes people kind of lump fascists and communists together, mostly because they generally exist in authoritarian states where there's kind of one leader, and the people's freedoms tend to be somewhat limited because the good of the country, the good of the state, comes before any of the rights of the individuals. So in that way, fascists and communists are very similar, but historically speaking, they are at opposing ends. And so fascists don't like communists don't like fascists, and they're actually very different. But sometimes we think about them the same because they're both kind of authoritarian systems, but they work differently. And so here you can see that people who are out on the right wing, really in any society, are a little more traditional, a little more conservative, and they are very interested in either restoring law and order or maintaining it. But of course, most people in Western democracies can be a little bit conservative, and so they're just a little bit to the right of center. Of course, fascists are way, way out there, right? And so we said that fascism, or supremacist nationalism as sometimes it's called, is born of a rejection of a lot of things that are happening in the early 20th century. And so, particularly if you think about what we talked about during the Roaring Twenties, right? We had this sort of cosmopolitan lifestyle emerging in the US, right? Lots of fun music and dancing and drinking and people having all sorts of luxury goods and fashionable clothes and living it up. And that's all kind of cosmopolitanism, right? This kind of luxury, leisure lifestyle. And of course, the fascists reject that along with all the other things that they reject, right? And we said that most of this rejection comes out of a faltering confidence in democracy, which is probably the feeling that Amanda and I have after last night's debate, right? Faltering confidence in democracy. Because again, in Eastern Europe and in Germany, the democratic governments that have been put in place aren't working very well. There's lots of small parties, so there's no kind of majority governments, there's just minority governments. None of them can agree on anything. Nothing gets passed, and of course the economic situation in these countries is very fragile, right? It's after the war, nobody has any money, unemployment is high. Some of these countries need to be rebuilt because there's been fighting that's occurred there, and people are looking at their democratic governments with frustration and anger and asking, isn't there a better way, right? This isn't working at all. And so this is where the fascists come from, right? They step forward and say that, you know, this democracy thing is ridiculous. You're putting the power in the hands of people who don't know how to run a country and don't know how to run an economy. Really what we need is a strong leader who will take us into the future, right? And so that's really what fascists are about, right? Keeping an eye on the past, because we said that fascists like to tell that nationalistic story of once we were great, right now not so much, but we will be great again and I will take you there, right? So fascists kind of have one eye on a great past, whether it was great or not. It doesn't have to be. It can be kind of imagined that way. A great past, kind of a crappy present, and but this leader will take you into a bright, glorious future for our people, right? That's the story. And so there were all of these things. I thought I'd put them into a slide. They were mentioned in the Italian fascism thing we read yesterday, but I think they're very important in defining fascism, right? The thing that, or the idea that there's a strong, charismatic leader, the idea that the state comes before any sort of individual rights. The leader is above the law, right? The leader creates the law. And so that's very different from democracy, right? Fascists are usually very ready to use violence against enemies of the state. And often enemies of the state are not outside the state, but inside it. And so fascists are very comfortable using violence against their own people. There's a single party, there's a dictator, and again, they are in the process of kind of rebuilding this society, taking inspiration from their traditional, heroic, exciting past and trying to use that to move into an exciting future, okay? The other thing I should point out is another good example of this kind of thing is from Captain America, the First Avenger, Red Skull. Red Skull is an excellent fascist because he's exactly like this. What's that? Well, think about how interested he was. So he was very autocratic, right? He was the leader with the vision for the future. He was very comfortable using violence against people to achieve his ends. He was very focused on science and technology, right, and sort of moving into the future. He was very interested in sort of creating the perfect people, right, the perfect man, because he had tested that super soldier serum on himself, resulting in his appearance. But he was trying to do just that thing, right? So Red Skull is of course he's tied to the Nazis in the film who are also fascists, but Red Skull is a perfect fascist. He models a lot of those traits really, really well. I should have put a slide of him in there. He's so good for this purpose. But a slightly more handsome fascist here, Benito Mussolini. Maybe that's debatable, I don't know. Maybe some of you have a thing for Red Skull, but anyway. Here's Benito Mussolini, who we talked about yesterday, an Italian fascist who kind of comes to power in the 1920s in Italy and will stay in power until close to the end of the Second World War, right? At which point he is executed by a mob. Spoiler alert.
Is it spoiler alert before you, after you finish the spoiler?
What's that?
You say spoiler alert after you say the spoiler.
Yeah, did I say spoiler alert after I said the spoiler? Oh, shoot. Oh, well. It happened like 70 years ago. Everybody, it's not like I have some, knowledge that no one has. The man is dead. You can see right there he's dead. We read this section, and I asked you yesterday, kind of a leading question, I suppose. Did he remind you of any current political leaders? And some people were already kind of thinking about that as they read it. But this is what I was kind of hoping you would say, that he does remind us a little bit of Trump. And I said that I thought he reminded me of Trump because, good morning, I thought he reminded me of Trump because neither of them have a very strong political ideology. And so Trump is technically on the right, because he's part of the Republican Party. He's supported by the Republicans. But if you listen to his ideas, they're not necessarily right or left wing. They're not liberal or conservative ideas. They're just whatever he thinks he should say at the moment, right? And then they're not strongly tied to an ideology. Both of them are actors on a stage, if you will. Both of them are kind of performing the role of president. Both of them have acting backgrounds, right? Benito Mussolini was an actor for a while. Trump pretended to be a successful businessman on his show, The Apprentice. And so both of them have acting in their background. Both of them are very charismatic and forceful public speakers. Mussolini definitely was. We'll get to Adolf Hitler a little bit later, and of course he was a very charismatic speaker as well. Trump, although I don't know if I would call him charismatic, people seem to show up to see him speak and listen to him. So I guess that means something, right? Huh?
That means something.
It means something. I wouldn't show up to watch him speak, but that's just me. And again, they are both of them kind of act in ways that are coming from their own personal ego and trying to get revenge on their enemies and perceived enemies of the country, right? So if anyone says anything critical of Trump, of course, he's all over them on Twitter, calling them names and things like that. Similarly, Trump had this idea that, the world is laughing at us, right? Everyone's laughing at America. Everyone's been taking advantage of us, and I'm going to fix that, which I don't think was necessarily the case. I don't think anyone was laughing at America. Definitely no one was taking advantage of them. If anything, it was the other way around. But again, this was the idea that he had. And so the question I asked you was, does this make him a fascist? Wow. And so, yeah, we had some initial thoughts about whether we thought he was fascist-y or not. But again, I assigned you a paper to argue this specific question, so we shouldn't just jump to our opinions. We should do a little bit of research and thinking, right? So the first thing I want to do is come up with a couple of arguments. And the arguments that I want to fill in here have to do with the papers I want you to read, okay? So the first one I'd like us to start with is the one that argues that Donald Trump is a fascist, okay? And so you'll find it in Microsoft Teams. It's in the class materials section, and it's called Is Donald Trump a fascist. There's another one in there that says, no, Donald Trump is not a fascist, but don't read that one right now. This is the one we want to read. Is Donald Trump a fascist? And so it's written here by Ben Worthy. He's a lecturer in politics at Birkbeck College. I don't know where that is, but he's an academic of some sort. And this is his argument, or at least I hope there's an argument in here, about why Donald Trump is a fascist, right? So what I'll do is I'll give you, I don't know, 15, let's go 15 minutes. Read the article and again, try to come up with Ben Worthy's argument. What is his conclusion, which I think I've already stated. What is his conclusion and what are his premises? What is he using to support that conclusion? Okay, so take 15, read that, figure out the argument, and then we will talk about it, okay?
From the class material.
Say again?
Yeah, from the two articles.
Yeah, but we're just going to read the one. We're just going to read the one right now. So just read the one that says, is Donald Trump a fascist? like a young child. Yeah, toddle is like a word for like walk in unstable fashion. So little kids who are just learning to walk. Yeah. They toddle along. Oh, still had it muted. Now I'm going to have to say the same thing again. Okay, so for online people, I had my mic muted twice. And so what I was saying, there was a question here about the popular vote in the last US election. Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump, so she won the popular vote. But that doesn't really matter because the US electoral system is such that they have these electoral college votes. Every state has a certain number of them, and that's what determines who's president. And so a candidate can get more votes than their opposing candidate, but it doesn't matter if they don't win the electoral college votes as well. So Hillary did not do that, and so she did not win the election, and instead we have Donald Trump. Okay. Now that I've said that a few times, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this very short article, right? Huh?
Have you seen the debate yesterday?
The what?
Debate? No?
I didn't see all of it. I saw little pieces of it.
He was interrupting the whole debate.
Yeah.
Is it fair?
Well, is it fair? Well, ultimately it depends on before a debate, usually you agree to certain rules. And one of the rules is almost always the fact that the moderator, who is Chris Wallace, has authority, right? So if somebody starts speaking and the moderator says, "Sir, hold on, zip it until the other person responds," or "My question is for this candidate, not you," you are supposed to listen to the moderator. That's what the moderator is there for. With no moderator, it's just a shouting match between two people. So,
Both were like shouting.
yeah, well, that's why it was obviously a disaster, right? Because they weren't the two candidates weren't listening to each other. Nobody was listening to the moderator, and that's why it was a complete. I'm not going to say it on camera.
Very dominating.
Well, he's a loudmouth bully, right? Is what he is, and he, you know, of course he has been that in the past. He is that, and of course he was that last night because that's who he is. Of course. Anyway, we'll leave that for a second. Let's go to the article. So we want to figure out the argument in this article. I've kind of given away the fact that that's what the conclusion is, right? That Donald Trump is a fascist, or at least we should think of him as one. Does anyone dispute that that is the actual main point or conclusion of this article? Is that what it is?
Which one?
The last parts of the article, the last paragraph, they said this is more like the one of the three leaders, where he would actually destroy the foundations of the republic and the democracy before letting in fascists.
That's true. So yeah, the Ben Worthy here is kind of making a point that he's not as comparable to a hardcore kind of fascist, right? So Hitler may, or Trump may or may not compare well with Adolf Hitler, for instance, or he may or may not compare well with Francisco Franco. But should we think of him as a fascist anyway, even though, you know, he's no Hitler? Sorry, Trump. He's no Hitler, right? But should we think of him as dangerous anyway? Should we think of him as a fascist? And I think one of the things we can take from this article is, in fact, that we should think of him that way. And so again, as good critical thinkers, we should ask, well, why, right? Why should we believe that this clown is a fascist? Or why should we think of him in that way? Ahmad.
They did mention a couple of camps. What camps were they?
The camps they're referring to, well, obviously some of the camps they're referring to are internment and concentration camps during the Second World War, particularly in Germany, of course. I'm sure you caught that. The camps they're referring to here are the immigration control camps in which illegal immigrants who are trying to enter the United States from their southern border are detained until their paperwork can be processed. And so they are basically imprisoned because they are in the United States illegally, and there have been lots of reports of these migrants being separated from their children, so their children are being held in separate facilities or separate areas. And so, of course, this is very distressing for everyone because they're basically imprisoned. They are, in cages, right? They're not allowed to leave, and their children are separated from them. And so there's lots of very disturbing reports coming out of sort of border services and the camps associated with them. So those are the ones that Ben Worthy's referring to.
So disturbing reports like they beat the prisoners, they assault them in other ways.
Basically, the fact that these people are being held in an internment camp style environment, and that their children, for some reason, are separated from them, for which I cannot imagine a rationale for this. Like, why would you separate a 5-year-old child from their parents in this situation? There's no logic behind that.
I do find that the idea of camps for illegal immigrants to make some kind of sense, but to separate children from their parents, that's...
No, it's not okay. And again, it's the question might be, Canada has illegal immigration as well, right? Not quite to the degree that the US does. We have illegal immigration as well, but we don't happen to have any camps for people. And so camps are not a necessity, but yet there they are. Anyway, what's a premise here? Why should we think of Trump as a fascist? Give me one premise.
He is present developing of public discourse, especially with the boundaries of decency and security.
Right. So he has. Okay, so we can say he has tried to. That's one thing a fascist would do, certainly, right? One thing a fascist would do is to. Rather than have sort of informed public conversation about issues, he would rather polarize people, right? And have them angry and upset and fighting with each other, right? Fascists can use that, right? Fascists can use anger and fear to achieve their own ends, right? Fascism doesn't do well where people are actually having intelligent public debates about things. What else do we hear?
Undermining democracy.
Right, so he has undermined democracy. In what way?
I think you said through his tweets.
Right, so if you look at his record on Twitter, you will see that he is no supporter of democracy, right? And he is constantly trying to undermine it, right? He is trying to weaken democracy from the inside. What else does the article mention? He's racist, right? So some fascists are racist. He's pretty racist, yeah. Some fascists are, specifically, we'll mention Hitler here. What?
He mentioned about the article mentioned about people who came from other places. They're Jews.
Yeah, he's very he's on record as
And then he's also anti-Muslim.
yeah, he is definitely against diversity and equality, right? And so whether it's a sort of a racism thing, or whether he's anti-immigrant, or whether he's saying things about African countries, which he's been on record about, I won't repeat what he said here. He's pretty clearly, he's pretty clearly a racist. Ayushi says he borrows in ways which fascists think and work. Yeah, so he thinks about things in the ways that fascists do, right? Fascists have no respect for democracy and diversity and equality, which the article points out, and fascists reject those things, and so does Trump, right? And the things he has said in public very clearly show that he does not like diversity, all of those racist comments and comments against immigrants. He's not into equality, and he's not really into democracy because he's trying to undermine it.
Is being racist someone's fault?
Is it someone's fault?
Yes, like does people choose to be racist? Or someone, because, well, let's say hypothetically, just for debate, that I'm racist, and I, for example, look at someone and I don't like them. I don't know that person, but for no reason I don't like that person.
Okay.
And then there is some other person who may not be of the same race as the people I'm completely feeling shitty about them. And I look at that person, I also don't like them. So am I racist to them as well?
Okay, social justice people, take it away.
The thing is that I think that it's deep in your mind that it's something happens. It's just not up to you. It's in your subconscious that you just don't like too much. It's nothing that you can change. You may control how you react to it, what you say, what you do, but the way you think you can't change it. Is that right?
Social justice people, do you want to take a crack at this?
Racism isn't necessarily not liking another race, it's thinking you're superior to them. And I think it's possible for you to be not born racist, but your surroundings obviously affect how you view other races. But once you're educated and once you know like you're not superior, then I think yes, it's your fault for being racist. If you're educated, yeah. Does that answer that question?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, well, I think Amanda's definitely right, and if it's okay, I'll expand on what you said. So what we talk about in social justice is the idea that you're right. We do absorb social messages, and we do absorb stereotypes about different types of people in society, and we kind of absorb some of those prejudicial ideas as well. And sometimes we are very conscious that we are being exposed to those ideas, and sometimes we're not, okay? And so in social justice, I like to use the metaphor of a computer virus. And you pick up a virus on your computer, you don't know where you got it, it just kind of gets in there and it's operating in the background. You don't really know what it's doing. You might not even know that it's there, but it's there and it's affecting the running of your computer. And so kind of stereotypical ideas and prejudices are like that. We absorb them, we don't really know that we don't really know what they're doing under the surface in our subconscious, and so they affect our kind of thoughts and behaviors. But Amanda is right, is that we can identify those beliefs and prejudices, and we can work to change them, right? And so I think in a way you kind of both said very similar things, but with using different language. But yeah, I think that we have to do both, right? We have to, like personally, I know that I could say something or I could behave in a racist or sexist way. That's very possible because I'm brought up in a country where racism is a thing, sexism is a thing. There are prejudicial ideas and stereotypes floating around our society, and I've probably absorbed some of them. But again, I can also be aware of those things, and I can also be aware of my behavior, and I can work to change them. So it's a bit of both, right? I think that sometimes we have to let other people and ourselves off the hook if we mistakenly do something or say something that is a little racist or a little sexist, because sometimes those things pop out as a result of our programming. But again, that's not really an excuse. We can't really say, oh, well, that's just the way I was raised, I guess, because we are, we are reasonably in control of our own behavior. We can say, look, I have this prejudice towards this. It is not true. And I can work to overcome it, right? And so, yeah, it's a bit of both. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. So, yeah, I think you're right. It does, in some ways it's not your fault, but once you know about it, then it's your responsibility to fix it. Yeah. Okay. Where the heck? Okay, and Ayushi says here he was praising the Nazis as well. Does anyone know what that was about?
No, it's crazy.
There was Charlottesville. I think it's in North Carolina, but don't quote me on that because I might be wrong. In a place called Charlottesville, there was a rally because they were going to take down the statue of a Confederate general. A bunch of neo-Nazis showed up. There was a bunch of people sort of protesting against racism. There was some conflict between the anti-racist people and the neo-Nazis, as you might imagine. There was conflict between them, and somebody drove their car into a crowd and injured a bunch of people and killed one person. And after this whole thing happened, Trump managed to go on air and say, oh, well, this is the fault of both sides. There's good people on both sides. And, he didn't step out and say, he didn't step out and condemn these neo-Nazis. Instead, he said there's good people on both sides. So, yeah, that's what Ben is referring to here. Okay, so what else do we have here? So, right, so that's more evidence of his anti-diversity kind of mindset, right? Is that he is against immigrants, he's against people from Mexico, and people with disabilities, right? He's mocked them as well, which is a pretty crappy thing to do. What else? What else do we have in this article? Okay.
Like praising your opponent, or saying something about, supporting democracy in public.
Right. So, yeah. He tries to flip it around and say, well, if he kind of thinks like a fascist, if you don't believe that, then when has he stood up for democracy? When has he stood up for equality and diversity? And of course, the answer is never, right? He's never done those things. And so, again, if he's not this, then he probably should be supporting democracy and equality and diversity. But he's not doing those things either. There's other things that he's not doing that dictators usually do, right? So, has he made himself a dictator? No.
Didn't say that. He acts like a dictator.
Yeah, he might want to be, but is he able to be?
No.
No, right? He's got to deal with the Senate, who seem to be in his pocket anyway, and he's also got to deal with Congress. He's got to deal with the House of Representatives, who is not on his side. So can he just do whatever he wants? Yeah, but executive orders can only be used for certain things. Well, he has, but actually Obama's used a bunch of them as well. So they are within presidential purview, like he is allowed to do them, and lots of presidents use them. So they're not a dirty word. An executive order is not a dirty word.
I don't know, it seems like he's using them way too much.
It would be interesting to see the statistics about executive orders to see if, let's say, Trump has used more than Barack Obama did. It, it is possible that one is being publicized more than the other.
I think Barack Obama boomed other countries more than Trump did.
What's that?
Barack Obama has, boomed other countries, he has grown a lot with other countries.
Okay, so he hasn't really started any wars with other countries.
No, but he's trying to dominate in the US.
Yeah, arguably the U.S. has always tried to do that.
Then he's very frank what he is doing.
It's true.
Start taking on war with China.
Trade war doesn't really count.
It's still something.
No, but Barack Obama bombed other countries, so many countries.
So he bombed.
They bombed other, some, but Trump didn't.
Hello. He did. But
Not compared
He
to
did.
Obama.
missile.
Shot one of your guys.
Yeah, that's.
Okay. This is kind of what I want to try to focus on here in this article. So in this article, I want you to focus on the beginning sentence of the second last paragraph. So there you'll see it says, this is not to say Trump is a full-on fascist dictator, much as he might want to be. He remains constrained so far. And so I think this is kind of where Ben's argument is turning here, is that there are lots of things that fascists normally do, right? They normally seize power, they get rid of their opponents, they become the sole dictator of their nation. There's marches and parades, and sometimes there's genocides, and sometimes there's all sorts of things happen in a fascist state. And are those things really happening in the United States? No, right? Is the United States a fascist country? No, right? And so there's lots of things that fascists do that Trump is not doing. And I think Ben is pointing out it's because he is constrained, right? The democracy of the US is strong enough to make sure that he can't just do whatever he wants, right? Although he would like to, but he can't so far.
The two fascists that you're talking about right now, compare them to Trump, they kind of started off in not exactly a good time. Like Hitler took the country from ruins, and Mussolini, I don't really know much about Italy, but apparently they just had a civil war or something.
Italy was a mess too. Yeah.
So both of those took a country was basically in this chaos and had to bring it up to order. So yes, they had everyone's support and they had the freedom to do whatever they want.
Yeah, context is important, right? And so both in Germany and Italy, we see fascism rise when it's a period of high unemployment and sort of social chaos, and everything's kind of out of control, and people don't like that, right? People want their country to be run in a predictable way. They want stability, right? They want peace. They don't want anarchy. Nobody wants that. Well, few people want it, but most people don't. So that's not really the situation that the US was in 2016. 2016? Yeah. That's not the position that the US was in. The US was fairly stable. Their economy was pretty good. And so maybe it's not the right type of environment for a fascist to come to power. Does that mean Trump is not a fascist? Right. So do you think, I'm kind of leading you here, but you can disagree with me. Do you think that Trump is, or that Ben Worthy here is trying to say something like, there's a bunch of things that fascists do, and Trump can't do those because he's constrained by democracy? And we might even say that he came to power in a time that is not really conducive to the rise of a fascist dictator. However, does he think like a fascist?
Yeah, that's a very good statement.
Oh.
That's a true statement.
So could we say, could one of the premises of this argument be, we should think of Donald Trump as a fascist? Why? Why should we think that? Well, because he thinks like a fascist. Trump looks at the world through the eyes of a fascist. He is against equality and democracy and diversity, which fascists are often against. Could that be the start of this argument? That even though he's not able to do all of the things that a fascist normally does, he thinks like a fascist. And so there might be a distinction to be made here. Is fascism up here, or is fascism something you do? Can you only be a fascist if you do the things that a fascist does, or is fascism a mindset, a way of approaching the world?
I like to look at it as something that you do.
What's that?
I like to look at it as it's a thing that you do, other than what you think.
Right, but
The other way would be a bit scary.
well, and that's the thing. That's what Ben, I think, is trying to point out here, is even though, Trump's hands are tied in a way, right? He can't just do whatever he wants. Is he thinking like a fascist dictator? Even though his hands are tied and he can't be one. Is he thinking like one?
Yes, he believes in himself.
Because there was a time, and this is jumping ahead, there was a time when Adolf Hitler was an elected member of the Reichstag, right, of the German parliament. He was an elected member of that. Was he elected? Or was he just leader of the party? Anyway, he was participating in a democratic system, semi-democratic system. Does that mean he wasn't a fascist? I think we would definitely want to call him a fascist, even if his hands were, at the moment, his hands were tied. Of course, later on, his hands would be unbound and he would get to do whatever he wanted. But at the time, he wasn't able to. But was he still a fascist? Did he still think in a fascist way?
Yes.
Okay. Let's take a break, because I know all of our brains are tired at the moment. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back, and we'll see if we can put this together into a nice little argument for ourselves, okay? Okay, and we're back. So, trying to put some sort of argument here together, I kind of feel like this paper turns on the fact that Donald Trump, we should think of Donald Trump as a fascist because he thinks like a fascist, right? He seems to be against equality and diversity and democracy. He hasn't, in any case, he has never stood up for any of those things, nor does he he hasn't acted in service of anything like democracy or equity or equality or diversity. And again, do you have to be? Is fascism a mindset? Is fascism something you think, and is it the way you look at the world, or is fascism something that you do? So is a fascist something? Is fascism something you think, or is fascism something you do? Hmm? Sure. Yeah. So compare it with racism. Can you be a racist without actually doing anything? If you don't express your racist views, or if you don't discriminate or commit hate crimes or anything like that, can you still be a racist?
You're just a good racist.
Okay.
You don't want to say you're not good.
I don't know if I go so far as good racist, but I know what you're saying. Yeah. So you can still be racist and not do anything about it, right? And so I think Ben Worthy is arguing here that you can be a fascist even if your hands are currently tied by the constraints of a constitution and a democracy, right? You may not be able to do all the things you want to do. You may not be able to act as a full-on dictator with, people marching down the streets and your own squad of, secret police or SS or whatever. You may not be able to do that, but you're still thinking about things as a fascist, right? Trump doesn't think about running a country the way that Barack Obama did or that Joe Biden does, right? Those guys they're Democrats, but not in terms of the party. They're Democrats in terms of they believe in democracy and the power of the people, right? That's where they're coming from. But Trump's not coming from there. Okay. Let's take a minute and read the second article, okay? The second article is in some ways easier to read and in some ways more difficult to read, and you will understand that when we read it, okay? Or it might be more difficult to figure out what the argument is, but let's read it. Again, I'll give you 15 minutes, and it is called No, Donald Trump is not a fascist and democracy is not dying. I think that's what it's called. So read the second one. I'll give you 15 minutes. We'll see if we can come up with an argument.
Will have hard time not to prove it.
What's that?
The writer will have a hard time not to prove him.
Well, I guess we'll find out. We don't want to prejudge, right? We want to see if we can think about this critically and logically, even though we might be predisposed to one position or the other. Okay, so there's just a couple seconds left there on the clock, but what's your impression of this article here?
It's not, the points are not strong.
The words are not strong?
I couldn't get 1 point.
You couldn't get 1 point? It's a bit confusing.
It's,
Adil's shaking his head, just no.
the statements are vague, it's not strong.
Ah, they're not strong. The statements are not strong. Okay. Ahmad, what do you think? It's what?
It's just all for Trump. It's not good when Trump good.
Oh yeah, so you can detect a bit of a bias here, right? Which is possible, right? Because he's definitely arguing, I guess, in favor of Trump, right? He's saying that Trump is not a fascist, but you can hear his you can hear this person's bias in the argument, right? Which again sometimes is okay, because if you're arguing something, then you tend to believe in it, right? So I like that you said those things, though, because yeah, I agree too. This is not very well written. This is not very well done. I don't think this is a very strong article, and I don't think it's a strong argument, but let's put that aside and just try to figure out what this person is attempting to argue here, okay? So Michaela here says, in the article there's a comparison between Hitler and Trump, where it shows the works of Trump is not greater than what Hitler did before, right? So there's almost a little bit of whataboutism here, right? Well, what about Hitler? He did all these bad things and Trump didn't do them, so yeah. So, but we'll get to that. So I think we could probably clearly say that the argument, or the conclusion in this argument, is that we should not see Trump as a fascist. Is that fair? That's the main point here. Okay, what's a premise for this argument? Why should we believe that Trump is not a fascist according to this article?
I don't know.
He didn't, like this part says, this comparison would be apt if Trump went on to purge and jail his opponents. So the fact that he didn't do that.
Okay, so lots of fascist dictators, when they get into power, they jail their opponents, or they execute them, or they exile them to Siberia or something like that. But in this case, Trump didn't do that. Probably because it's illegal, but he didn't do it, right? So Trump didn't do a thing that dictators have done, therefore he is not a fascist. Give me another one. Again, you don't have to agree with the premise, you don't have to think it's legitimate, you just have to be able to understand what this person is trying to present to you as a premise for this argument.
They did say something that kind of proves him being
They also mentioned about the voting.
Say again?
the thing that they compare. It's not saying that Trump's not a fascist. It's more like it's saying that he is a fascist. When they said that he's focusing on crimes committed by illegal immigrants.
Okay. Is that in the paragraph that says progressives imagine?
I think it's on the same. Yeah.
Okay.
They compared it to Hitler focusing on crimes committed by illegal.
Right. So they kind of admit, they kind of acknowledge the other side of the argument, right? The idea that that both Trump and Hitler focused on crimes committed by, I'm just going to say outsiders, right? People who are outside the nation. So they're almost admitting something, right? This argument is saying, yes, well, this is sort of the same, but, right? And then they go on to the next part and they say, but, Hitler was named chancellor in 1933, and immediately he, passed the Enabling Act. He got full dictatorial powers, and he started ruling by decree as a dictator. But did Trump do that? No, he didn't do that. So again, he didn't do something that a dictator did, right? Hitler gained power, and immediately he consolidated all of that power into his own office, right? So we'll get to this, but he took the office of president and chancellor, and he combined them into Führer, and he had full power. But did Trump do that?
Yeah, but this is something stupid about this part, is that the year that Hitler got to power, there were 3 elections in the same year because of the chaos. So again, how can you compare that to this? It's just a stupid comparison.
Right. What's the thing that this author says about the democracy thing? What's their premise there? And I'm just going to put this up, this thing that Ayushi said here. He's trying to make sure all election voters are identified and not illegal immigrants.
Yeah, he mentioned
That is something that, yeah, that is something that Trump has been hammering at for a long time, about illegal voting, right? People voting who are illegal immigrants or people who are not citizens or do not have voting rights. He's been hammering this story for a long time. Trump has. There is no evidence that this is the case. There is almost no evidence of voter fraud in any state. Every state has like a handful of them every year. It's not a thing, right? It's not a problem. But to listen to Trump, he thinks it's a widespread problem. The election is compromised because all kinds of people are voting illegally. But there's just no evidence for that, unfortunately. Not unfortunately, fortunately. There's no evidence for that.
Trump makes sure that everyone is legal because you know that the U.S. Everyone is racist.
Well,
They're not gonna vote for anyone.
that's the case in every country, right? Every country has to make sure that they are that their elections are legitimate and that only people who are allowed to vote actually vote. That's the job of here in Canada. We have Elections Canada. That's the job of Elections Canada, is to make sure that the election happens according to the rules. That's the job of Elections BC. We have a body that oversees elections, and so again, every country and state and province and whatever has to make sure that the election is legitimate, right? And only the people who are allowed to vote do vote. But by and large, that is what happens. The bigger problem is getting people to vote, right? Because often the voter turnout is 50, 60%, right? So really the problem is actually getting people who are legally allowed to vote, rather than stopping the people who are not allowed to vote. That's not the problem. The problem is, like, you want more people to vote. You have to encourage people to vote. There's no, again, in the United States and in Canada, there's no evidence of voter fraud, right? There's a couple of cases here and there. That's it. But of course, Trump feels that there is. But what's this author saying about elections here and fascism? He's trying to,
Sorry about the electoral votes.
yeah,
I don't really get it.
okay. Where is that?
Towards the end.
Towards the end.
Talks about how the Democrats couldn't get like the 270 votes they needed.
Oh. Okay, it says, it is true that Trump won despite losing the popular vote, but the Electoral College is nothing new or untoward. It can't be that Democrats thought not long ago to have a lock on the presidency suddenly can't muster 1270 electoral votes. Right. So I think what the author is saying here is that they're making a bit of a dichotomy between fascism and democracy, right? And so they're saying, well, Donald Trump's not a fascist because he came to power through democracy. He was elected, right? So the author here is trying to say, well, fascism and democracy are not compatible. So how is it possible that a fascist is elected?
No, Hitler was elected.
Hitler was elected. right? So, and in fact, we'll get to this a little bit later, but when you think about it, fascism can only come from a democracy. It can only appear out of a democracy, because if you look at communism, communism only allows one party, the Communist Party. You can't have a fascist party in a communist state. They're not allowed. Same thing in a monarchy. Monarchies don't have political parties at all. So you can't have a fascist party in a monarchy. Usually the only way that fascists come to power is out of a democratic system that allows multiple parties to legally exist. So just because a fascist is elected doesn't mean they're not a fascist. But anyway, this article is trying to say that a fascist couldn't possibly be elected into power. But of course, that's not true. What else is in here? Why else should we believe that he is not a fascist? Let me ask you this. This is a bit of a judgment here, but do you think this is a good, valid argument so far?
No.
Not so much, right? Some of these premises are not, that's a premise, right? One of the premises of this argument is a fascist couldn't possibly come to power by being voted in, because fascists are anti-democratic, right? But is that premise true? No, it is not true, right? Fascists have come to power within democracies. They have been elected into power. So even though that might be logical support for their conclusion, that premise is not true, right? So it doesn't help their argument. Lots of fascists, when they come into power, they jail their opponents or execute them or exile them. And Trump didn't do that, right? So that's a premise, right? The premise is that fascists come into power and get rid of all their opponents, and Trump did not do that thing, right? But again, does that mean he's not a fascist, right? Just because he can't act in the way that other fascists have, does that mean he's not a fascist, right? So maybe this is the last thing I'll say, because we're running out of time and some of you look a little like limp, like unwatered plants at the moment. I would suggest that this article, even though it is poorly argued, is trying to say that fascism is something you do, right? Fascists do these things. Did Trump do them? No, he didn't do them. Therefore, no fascist.
But he's preparing for that.
Well, that's the thing, right? And that's the thing that the Ben Worthy article that we just read was trying to argue, that it doesn't really matter if he does all the things that a fascist does. He looks at the world through the eyes of a fascist. Fascist is a mindset. It's a way of wanting the world to be. It doesn't matter if your hands are tied or not. You're still a fascist, just like you're still a racist, even if you don't do racist stuff. And so here we have kind of two opposing arguments, right? Yes, he's a fascist because he thinks like one, and it doesn't matter if his hands are tied. Here, this article we've just read, they're trying to convince you that, well, no, he's not a fascist because he hasn't done the typical fascist things. Therefore, no fascist. Two opposing arguments. Which to believe?
You don't trust in democracies. It's like we haven't learned anything from history, how stupidly democracies fall. Republics just get rolled up.
Yeah, democracy is fragile, right? And the thing that keeps getting quoted, this is the last thing I'll say because we got to go. The line that keeps coming up, at least for the United States, is the thing that Ben Franklin says. So Ben Franklin is one of the founding fathers. He's an important historical figure in the U.S. And when they finished drafting the Constitution of the United States, there's this famous story, I don't know if it happened, where Ben Franklin comes out of the chamber where they've all been negotiating. All of these kind of big political leaders in the U.S. have been negotiating on the Constitution. And Ben Franklin comes out the front door, and this woman says, you know, Mr. Franklin, you know, what do we have? Do we have, you know, a republic or a monarchy, right? And so, and Ben Franklin famously says, a republic if you can keep it. And so, again, I don't know if that actually happened. I don't know if he ever said that, but that's the story. And so, yeah, democracy is something that you only have if the people continue to do it, if the people fight for it and hang on to it. Because if you don't, somebody will take it from you, right? Someone like Hitler, someone like Mussolini, maybe someone like Trump, right? They will take it from you if you do not fight for it. But anyway, okay, tomorrow I will talk a little bit about essay stuff. I will put your quiz marks on Student Portal tonight so you can see them, although you've already seen them, I think. Yeah, that's what we'll do tomorrow. I'll talk a little bit about paper stuff, and then maybe we'll transition into Hitler stuff. You shouldn't smile for that. Okay, online people, good work today. I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.